Do you enjoy a story with a prologue, or do you prefer to get straight into the action? Why might writers use prologues and epilogues, and how can they add interest and a little storytelling boost to your novels? I guess this is a prologue of sorts. Welcome to the Writer's Gym. The Writer's Gym podcast. Build creative confidence and grow your writing life with Rachel Knightley and Emily Inkpen. Rachel Knightley and Emily Inkpen.
Chris Gregory.
Welcome to this week's episode.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any parish notices or things you'd like to say before we get into our discussion about prologues and epilogues?
Just that whatever notice we give needs to be not directly relevant to whatever comes next, because the wonderful thing about a prologue is it makes us go, ooh, I wonder how that's going to be relevant, or it's hanging over whatever happens next. So apparent irrelevance is king.
Yes, absolutely.
So my parish notice, and obviously no one would be able to see this, but you are both attired in Bowie-themed clothing.
Yep.
Would you like to just describe what you're wearing, just because I think it's important that listeners can picture us as we record?
Sure.
Rachel's not so sure.
Rachel thinks that's a stretch, clearly.
I mean, it's lycra, so it is a stretch, but I don't know if I want to share that with them.
We are both reasonable fans of Bowie, I think it's fair to say. I think Rachel outstrips me by some way on the Bowie fandom. I'm getting that by looking around the room at this moment in time. I feel like, there's a few references going on. I'm just wearing the lightning stripe sparkly jumper.
Yes.
Which is,
and I have his name across my breasts in diamante. So the clues probably are there.
I think the clues are there.
And if you want to hear and find out more about
how
Bowie,
is this to do with
Bowie
prologues and
fandom?
epilogues?
Well, it's not. That's the point. But
Because
we can bring it back.
We can bring it back.
We can bring it back later. That's how it will be.
You started by saying don't make it relevant to the rest of the episode. So.
Oh, I see what you did. Okay, well, I don't have anything to add to the fact that I have his name across my breasts in diamante.
But do
as should all right-thinking people, and there's a should.
Whether or not they have breasts.
Absolutely.
Do listen to our episode about music and writing for more about Bowie fandom and other music fandom.
Yeah.
But let's get back to the business in hand.
The business in hand, yes.
Prologues and epilogues. Do we have, to start with, a description of what prologues and epilogues are? Emily Inkpen has raised her hand. It's great for radio. Emily.
Yeah, I put my hand up. So I looked this up, the actual definition, because I think a lot of people know what a prologue is.
Are you going to speak Latin to us?
I am not going to speak Latin to you, no. I'm a communicator. Nobody speaks Latin. So a prologue is officially a separate introductory section of a literary, dramatic or musical work. That's what they are described as.
Excellent.
And an epilogue?
Oh, well, that comes later.
Yes.
We start with the prologue, Rachel.
Thank you for that exposition of the bleeding obvious, Emily.
I mean, if we're going with definitions.
Well, and let's go from the textbook definition. Thank you, Emily.
Humour is greatest when it comes from who we truly are, from the way we think as people. That was a good example.
So let's apply that to our writing then, Rachel.
With any luck, yes.
So describe broadly what a prologue would look like or like in our writing.
Without actually repeating myself in terms of the apparent irrelevance that the reader knows it's a sort of unspoken contract that it's going to be relevant, but we don't know how yet, which allows us to do things like, for example, the classic one, of course, is body is discovered in prologue, and then unbeknownst to the people that we now meet in chapter 1, that's going to be relevant to them, or possibly beknownst to the detective, there will be a body at some point because that's their job. You know, we might meet them that way. So detective fiction is very good friends with that technique. as is thriller writing, as are a lot of things. Some of the domestic noir that I really, really enjoyed that started as a subdivision of crime fiction and is now moving its way back into thriller because it's all about performance and reality. It's all about lookatmyperfectlife.com versus what's going on behind closed doors. And that uses the technique as well. I mean, it is all over the place. And it's a really good way, I think, of getting a first draft going because it allows you to think about apparently different things that might be in your head for this story without needing to know how they fit together, yet it can be a way of starting in different corners of the jigsaw and moving to meet yourself. So I think it's a really nice technique to explore for that reason.
Lots of films and TV shows have this thing before the credits come up. It's got a name, actually. Do either of you know what that's called on a TV?
Do we lose
film?
Credit on the course if we don't know?
I don't have my hand up.
No. Okay, well,
Let's just not meet his eyes and see if he doesn't ask.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe there's someone else here.
Glad I'm at the back row.
So that's a fail from Ricky. No, it's called,
Is it pre-credit, pre-roll?
It's got a little name. It's called a cold open.
Oh.
And so some examples of famous ones that you will probably have seen. Most of the Bond films have a little sequence before the credits come up. They seem to get longer and longer, so that you can get 10 minutes of cold open before the credits come up. And quite often those bits are not hugely relevant to what then happens. It's just like, I've got this sequence, it's really full of action, and let's get into it.
He said James Bond, and then he said longer and longer, and now I can't.
That's just your mind, Rachel.
Yeah.
And the show that I think did this really, really well was, I think, called 6 Feet Under.
Oh,
which was an early
yes.
HBO show, which I absolutely adore.
Yes.
And the cold... Well, tell us about what the cold opens were in 6 Feet Under.
God, that was brilliant. That was just brilliant. A different life. You meet a different character every episode and how they die, and then you get the birth and death credits of that person before you go into the credit sequence, so set in an Undertaker's. And the way that over the course of all of those series it went towards everybody you knew in the series dying at the end, even if it was way, way, way past the time that the series ended, and they'd think about maybe it was going to be like this in the future and you weren't quite sure if it was really happening or if people were just imagining. And it did that really beautiful thing that it made it very clear that what we never quite believe, that we are also mortal, that everybody is in the same situation. So it was very literally a cold opening, and I think that was an in-joke that they did, was it was a different customer, shall we say, of the Undertakers each time, and you saw these different geographies and these different family relationships, and it was absolutely hypnotic.
Yeah. I think my favourite 6 Feet Under cold open was we were just following this guy walking and chatting to people along the way, and you thought, how's this going to fit the pattern? Because it was always the death, wasn't it, in the cold open? And suddenly he was just walking by some bushes and a wild cat of some sort just leaps out and takes him down. And then it goes into the credits. And it's just beautifully done, wasn't it? But that's TV and movies. Let's go back to the world of literature. What is the advantage of using a prologue in your story? Emily is still persisting with her technique of putting her hand up, which is no more good for radio now than it was 10 minutes ago.
It was 10 minutes ago, but apparently I'm still in that space.
Hey, it works.
Yeah, I'm still in that space, apparently. So for me, a prologue provides an opportunity and a chance to explore a different perspective. So in terms of writing Dex Legacy novels, the POVs all the way through the novels are vary in Isra and Ren. But in the Blood Road, we start with a character called Asta in the prologue. In book 2, we start with Neverly in Oskyll, who is the wife of the Chancellor. And I think in book 3, we're with the Prime Minister of Xenos as the opening. All of them do the foreshadowing thing. They are very, very removed characters, or they are just, I mean, Asta is pretty involved, but the other two are very removed characters. But what they're talking about and what they're referring to is very relevant to what happens in the plot. And I love that, and I love the external viewpoint. One of the great things about writing something like Dex Industries is that it is such a closed nation that getting an external viewpoint on what's happening there or what that country means to the rest of the world is really fun, and also I think necessary for providing an international picture of the sort of landscape. I love the sort of the variety, the fresh approach, the unexpected. And it can be an unexpected beginning. And then you sort of chapter 1 comes along and then you're, okay, right, I'm in it now. But you've had this zoning in almost, like you're in the world, but you're not quite with the characters that you're going to be with. But it's all relevant to them. And then the mystery of how is this going to be relevant? How is this?
I mean, I would also say your audio drama episodes begin with the character Otto.
Oh, yeah, Otto's intro.
Saying a few words at the start of the episodes as well, which is a prologue, isn't it?
It's kind of a prologue. It's really it's a previously on as well.
Yeah.
But Otto is also a character, or became that way. So the way she frames the previously on and the way she sort of describes what's happened is often very biased. And the way she sort of recounts events is normally very pro Varian Isra and Wren, very anti Nathaniel Osa Devigan.
See unreliable narration.
Yeah, she is not a sort of neutral source of information. Yeah, I love a prologue.
Yeah.
I love a
Rachel,
prologue.
what are your thoughts on, your opening thoughts on the prologue?
I was just thinking about Holly. I was thinking about the first 2 series of Red Dwarf.
Yes.
Where you have the computer's head projected onto space, looking as deeply unimpressed with things as usual. 3 million years from Earth, the mining ship Red Dwarf. Its crew, Dave Lister, the last human being alive, and so on.
And a creature evolved from the ship's cat.
Who was a creature evolved from the ship's cat. Message ends. Additional, and then there's a different joke for additional. And they didn't relate directly to the plot, but they set the mood beautifully. I'm not going to quote them, although I probably could in potentially the right order, which says more about me than it does about this podcast. But it was a way of setting the mood, of giving you a sense of the world rather than of necessary specifics about what you were going to come in on, which is a really confident opening for a series. You know, it's not, here is a recap. And recaps can sometimes feel a bit too much like, here's what you need to know before you're allowed to enjoy this. And it went the opposite way to that. So, you know, I'm not saying they always do, but it can. And this was just a lovely way of doing it because every episode existed in its own territory. The characters were very well drawn, but it wasn't an overarching plot at that stage. It was episodic in a genuine sense back then. Anyway, going back to audio drama on that, we have often laughed at the fact that I am not the only person in this room who was brought up with the Archers in the background, usually with my mother tutting and turning it off when it came on, or my aunt turning it on when it came on, but these are the 2 kinds of Radio 4 listener that you have. But the fact that it's not about something being necessarily absolutely fascinating of itself, if you build up your understanding of the world and your faith and comfort in the relationships between characters, it's not always about the drama. Among many other things it's done brilliantly. It did a brilliant storyline on coercive control, which had very real world results and improvements in understanding of what that could look like and the fact that it can happen to anybody.
Yeah.
That was very, very important. Another, and this is something that I've wanted to do with some of my stories, is that sense of whatever is happening somewhere could be happening anywhere. You know, it can happen to you. So maybe prologues and epilogues provide, for me anyway, an opportunity to remind myself, remind my world, remind my readers, everybody is connected, even when you can't see how they're connected. We all are connected. And how are we going to find this out in here, that any book you read is at some level about you and about possibilities that affect you.
Really nicely put. So we've talked a little bit about what prologues can do. We've talked a little bit about the types of prologue that might be out there. For a writer listening to this podcast, first of all, why might they use a prologue and how might they go about writing a prologue? So, for example, is it something you would do at draft stage, or would you do it as part of your edit, right at the end, for example?
Can I declare a a misstep that I remember, and I know why it happened, is that I was first coming back to writing, sort of coming out of my MA and going, help, what the hell is going on, in about 2007. And there are fashions, and there are always fashions for everybody's doing it, nobody's doing it. And I resisted adding a prologue to what I was doing because the messaging I was getting at the time was don't do it. As you know, all of my career since has been about helping people step away from what are the shoulds and into what works for this story. And I resisted and resisted and resisted putting a prologue in this particular thing. And as soon as I did, I understood other things about that story. The one I'm working on now doesn't, and that's for its own reasons too. But I think for a first draft stage, I would actually recommend it, because that sense I was talking about earlier about allowing yourself to be irrelevant, allowing yourself to not quite know how this piece is going to join up with that piece yet. I think that is a really good way of allowing yourself to be curious rather than fearful or over-organised or feeling like you're supposed to know already.
Yeah. I think for me, when I first started writing decks, the Asta prologue in book 1 was originally chapter 5, and it was while I was writing it, like it was in the drafting, like the editing phase, and then suddenly I realised her chapter should be the prologue. And I needed to rewrite it, obviously, because there were moments in it where I was like, okay, this is definitely the mood, and this is definitely what we're doing with it. But I need to then obviously rewrite it in the context of a prologue and foreshadowing what is going to come as opposed to what has already happened up until then. But it just suddenly clicked into place that that was the right place for it. I really wanted this chapter in there. I wanted this perspective. It wasn't the right moment for it. And then putting it before the rest, it made sense.
Yeah.
Then writing the subsequent books, the prologue has always come first. And I know roughly what's coming in the world and in the story. And the act of writing that prologue has sort of provided me with and now I am centering myself in this world. And I get a similar sensation to that when I'm watching, Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, the beautiful opening. Now, some people hate the opening of Fellowship of the Ring, where Galadriel is narrating what has been before. The world is changing. I feel it in the air. That whole sequence where we recount what has happened in Middle-earth. But for me, watching that is like sinking into the world. Like the world is a bath and I am sinking into it. And then by the end of that intro, I am in it. Yeah. And then we get to Frodo in the Shire and we get to what's happening now.
It's a version of what Tolkien does in the book, but it's not the same.
No.
We get a long essay about hobbits and their history, don't we, at the start of the book, which I struggled with. 12-year-old me reading that for the first time. It's like, get on with it. Yeah. J.R.R. But so I think the film certainly catches the spirit and essence of that and does that world building job. And I was going to talk
using
about
the tools that were available to them that weren't available to Tolkien,
but from a different slant. So I think a point I was going to make, and you got there ahead of me, I think, is therefore if we are writing something that has a world, has a distinct world, is the prologue a good place to kind of introduce that world from a distance, as it were, before we then focus in on characters within it?
The thing is, you can't not. The best way to introduce a world is not to be caught doing it. When you're introducing the world, it's from inside the world. No matter what perfectly normal street I'm walking down, I'm introducing the reader to it as I go. Yes, there are wonderful things that we all know and love, like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy literally telling you, which evolved from radio into the book.
Also
and
Star Wars.
Yeah.
The opening.
And Red Dwarf Series 3. And, I absolutely all for it, but it would be wrong to say that some are introducing their world and some aren't. You're always introducing your world.
I guess what I'm talking about here is the long lens, here is the world entire, as it were. But we're not just looking at how it is now. We're looking at the history as well. So we're taking a long view on history.
In the beginning was.
Yeah.
Or what you need to know is.
Yeah. I don't
think we've ever used the Bible as an example in the Writer's Gym before.
We have now.
When you're writing biblical text, religious text, readers.
The thing is,
when you are creating a universe, make the following things very clear. Well, yes, we are.
I think the thing is with the Galadriel opening is that it is still narrated by Galadriel, who is this ancient being who is recounting something. So even though she's recounting it from a very historic, wide lens, it is still her telling the story. And I think a lot of prologues are getting in the head of someone in the world, but that somebody is doing something that is specific to the world, or like in an environment where they get an overview of what's happening. It's wrong to say that prologues are back from the action. They can be very personal, but they are just a sort of a stepping stone into what's going to happen. So when I open my latest book, Evolutions 1, it's very, very close lens on Israel, on this sort of battlefield, but it's like before a battle. And it's 300 words, roughly. And it's just in her head in that moment. What is she seeing? How does it relate to where she's been? And what is she feeling at that time? And that's it. And then we go into, and now she's being a teenager in a battle area, and she's got all this bravado. But for that moment, we're in her head. We are present in the world for a short amount of time. And it's almost like starting a story with, and here we go. You know, it's the and is that sort of function.
Well, I think that, I mean, there's a trope, I think in, you mentioned crime fiction, I think, where we see a murder or whatever. I mean, horror films often start with a gory murder to kind of get us into the action, but also to show us that there is something horrible out there, the stakes that our characters are going to face, and we then meet the characters after the credits.
It's an ironic use of hope that if you have bought a certain kind of ticket, it is a very good way of going, yes, this is the kind of world you're expecting. It's saying, don't worry, that's coming. And then knowing that you're going to get what you've paid for. You settle into the normality knowing it's coming. And quite often, if the storytelling is strong enough, you've almost forgotten what you've seen at the beginning. And then there's an oh yeah moment as it starts to creep back towards you. And that is an enjoyable thing to do. So, not just in horror.
We need to move on from prologues, because otherwise the bit about epilogues will be...
And the epilogues
will be at the end. Emily, do you have a definition of epilogues?
Well, I'm finding it.
But just while you're looking for it, then, just one last question about prologues. Is there a danger that a prologue can be overly long, overly distracting, show us something that doesn't fit the character and feel of the rest of our story?
I mean, everything can always be too long. It is a question of, in your first draft, you're working it out. By the time you've gone through the entire book, you'll know how much is useful in the prologue. You'll probably have gone, ooh, I can move that over there and my life is better. You know, you'll have done a lot of things. But yes, the light the touch paper and retire idea is where we're aiming for. Less does tend to be more, but not when you're at the writing, creating, making it come out of your head onto the page stage.
I always find the ones that
30 pages on Hobbits.
The ones that go to print that are very long tend to be very established writers who are maybe being self-indulgent or just don't feel the need to edit it.
Or the editor's dent.
Yeah, exactly. Too big to edit is a thing in publishing where they know the book's going to sell anyway. So why spend the time and resources editing this book that they know is going to be a bestseller, even if it goes out in its early draft form? So from a business point of view, you can kind of understand it, even if it is a bit of a shame. So I find that prologues can get a bit obnoxious if you've got a writer who's very established and isn't being cut down as much as they used to be.
Observe the fact that we're not naming names here.
No, I mean, this is something that I've noticed as a trend. I can't actually pull, I know there's a few writers out there who do this. I mean, it is a trend that I've noticed in established writers as opposed to early writers who get cut down a lot more.
And even then, there's also, I'm sure you've had this, there's the awareness that there will be somebody for whom that is a nice hot bath, and actually,
who love it.
they're fine.
Yeah, well, by the time you've got a fan following and everything, they're
Yeah.
there for it.
Yeah.
The longer the better. They love it. When you're, a debut writer and you're writing an entire chapter on the
You're not
history of
somebody's
hobbits,
bath yet.
Exactly. You're not somebody's bath yet. There's a statement I never thought I'd make. You're not that. And you haven't got to that point yet. So don't hang about. Okay, epilogues. Hand in the
go.
air. An epilogue is a section of speech at the end of a book or play that serves as a comment on or conclusion to what has happened.
Interesting.
That's what it says.
Well, I have questions. I have questions related to this, but let's do what we did with prologues then. So that's the theory. Let's go practical with Rachel.
I was just amusing myself remembering the one in A Midsummer Night's Dream, if we shadows have offended, think of this and all is mended.
All is mended,
you have
yeah.
just slumbered here while these visions did appear. So don't get cross with us if you didn't like it.
Yeah.
Now, that, thank God, is... And I love Shakespeare and I love what Shakespeare did almost all of the time. But apologising for yourself takes a lot of time. And that's one of the things that in speech, as in writing, nobody is ever less happy for when I'm apologising for myself in the following ways or asking you to say how great I am. When you take out all of that, whatever you're saying or writing is always received more honestly by the reader or hearer. I was remembering quite how much I enjoy that. That is absolutely a fairy tale. That is just, don't worry, it's all fine. But generally, I guess what I'm really picturing for modern epilogues that I'm enjoying these days, it's a bit like, those children's butterfly paintings where you paint on one side of the page
Fold it over.
and you fold it over and there's a symmetry to it. And it's not necessarily about what it contains. It's the sense that it's part of a whole. And it's that symmetry. As humans, in faces, in stories, we like that sense of full circle, really, that that it will be reflecting where it has come from. It will be honouring, I'm so sorry, Chris, the journey.
It's like a melody, isn't it, that comes back to a tonic note, and there's the tension while you're away, but and you wanting it to come to resolve back, and you can do that, can't you? But there's other things you can do as well. I mean, you can wrap up loose ends, but you can actually make the ending more ambiguous by what you say in an epilogue as well. I mean, are epilogues things what you have used, Emily?
I think epilogues are most effective when you're using a narrative voice or like a narrator. So in our previous episode, we did talk about narrators, and I feel like the best epilogues flow naturally from having that kind of device to play with. But if you don't, and you suddenly insert a character providing an epilogue of reflection at the end, then it could be weird. And I can't think of any examples. Epilogues are a lot less common than prologues. I have read an epilogue that was by the author, pretty much apologising for what just happened or like explaining themselves. But I always hate that. It's
like a disclaimer, isn't it?
It's a disclaimer, really. Yeah, and I don't like that. It's like, you've written a book, don't apologise for
Have the
it.
guts to stand by.
Yeah, just be like, you know what, I've written this, make of it what you will, and I don't need to hear an apology from the author at the end of it, or an explanation or a justification for what's just happened or what they wanted to achieve. That's the moment for asking questions at a reading or something. That's when those questions happen. You don't need it at the end of a book. So, yeah, and I tend to, if there is an epilogue and it's like that, I just don't read it. I'm like, I don't need your justification right now.
You don't know it's going to be like that unless you've read.
Well, I read a little bit and then I'm like, I don't
like this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's my DNF kind of moment, I think.
Yeah. I mean, another type of epilogue is the one that takes the story into the future. So, dear reader, they were married and they had 4 beautiful children.
Oh, but I hate that as well.
Yeah.
Or, in manner of a Lisa Jewell novel, and I won't say which one so that I don't go anywhere near spoiler, person who has done the bad things is alone on a bus and thinking about how they're now potentially able to do other bad things that you thought they wouldn't be able to do, meaning that if there is a sequel, you're buying it instantly. I have mixed feelings on that because it makes me go, oh, but I wanted a resolution because I'm a bit like that. But also commercially.
Economically, you can see how
commercially, I hear you.
Yeah.
So there's another type that I really don't like as well, which is the tone of it is, And the moral of the story was this.
Oh, yeah.
If you want to be Aesop, be Aesop.
Yeah.
Don't wait till the end to spring it on us.
There was a trend in a lot of American TV shows in probably the 70s and 80s where you'd always get a moral at the end of the story.
Yeah.
I didn't like that at all because I want to bring my own version.
Yeah.
of
Trust your reader is one of the first things.
Yeah, that's the thing, yeah.
It's one of the first things. If we feel patronised as readers, if we feel like you think you have to explain it to us, we don't think you're at final draft stage yet.
Yeah, and I think that if you're justifying what you've done, you haven't justified it enough in the text.
Yep.
If you feel the need to later justify it, you've missed something in the body of the work.
And the fundamental psychological truth is anybody who says, I'm the kind of person who... That's what they're saying. We actually see it by what they do.
Yeah.
And most people who need to stand there and say, I'm the kind of person who, if you put them in context, they're usually hoping rather than reporting. And, you know, that is absolutely true on the page as well.
Yeah.
characters who say, I'm kind of a big deal around here. It's like, we'll be the judge of that. So, writing an epilogue then. First of all, for a writer who's never done one before, should you adopt a different style, a different tone, a different voice in your epilogue?
Things you could do. You could explore a loose thread that you've identified. Or maybe that you think maybe the reader's actually forgotten that was even there and it's going to be an, oh yeah, wow moment, which I mentioned Lisa Jewell does in one particular case that I really like. Another thing you can do is you can make it a closed ending. You can show us what happens afterwards. If the story demands that, you can give it an open ending, as in maybe they're on to the next adventure, maybe it's whatever needed to happen has happened in this world, or maybe the world has changed in a way that it's useful for us to see. The only limits are ever your imagination. So what I would absolutely say about any of these is do play, do see what you want to explore in an epilogue. And it might be that it stops being an epilogue and becomes a final chapter, or it might be you decide you don't need it, but you enjoyed writing it. And all of this is valuable. The whole thing about the iceberg, that the reader only sees the tiny bit above the ocean, but you've done all of the work that is underneath it in order to make that happen. This can be a really glorious exploration. So it's really about going out there and enjoying it.
And sometimes you write the epilogue at the very beginning.
Absolutely.
You can write an epilogue at the start.
And work towards it.
And then whether you need it at the end is another matter. I think that's probably a very good use of epilogue as a tool. Maybe not the justification epilogue. That's a particular pet hate of mine. But as I've iterated, one of the things, so in movie form, I was going to ask you guys this. In movie form, the scenes at the end of the credits in Marvel movies. When you've watched all of the credits and then there's a random scene at the end that might be the characters who have been in that movie or might be the characters that are going to be in the next Marvel movie, there's normally some foreshadowing of what the next movie is going to be or what is going to happen in the future. I guess what that is doing in a storytelling sense is providing a sense of continuity. The story that we've just watched is wrapped, but there is more, dear reader. There will be more. And stay tuned, basically. And that's an interesting sort of...
Well, you did something like this, Emily. There was an episode of The Dex Legacy in season 2 where you had a bit of action after the end credits. It wasn't really an epilogue, but it was...
bonus scene.
A bonus scene. And I think that our reason for doing it was to give greater impact to an event. So that we were ending the episode on a cliffhanger or event.
If you end and then you have the credits, it can dilute the ending. But if you end and then everything just goes quiet at the end of a line... The
danger being, though, that people switch off the moment the theme music
which is why you have to say, there is a bonus scene at the end of this episode. Stay to the end, please.
Which sort of...
Or actually,
not in that voice.
We were brought up on Have I Got News for You? And they would occasionally do a lovely thing where there would be a little extra bit after the credits and you would feel like you'd won by staying to the end. And one of them, I do remember Angus Deaton absolutely... poker face it, good job no one's watching, knowing that we were. And Richard Osman's House of Games does that. They have whoever the prize winner is with their prize saying something amusing or daft at the end. And having a little, it's kind of Easter egg like almost, that you could miss it, but you could not. And that word spreads, that confidence spreads.
It's almost like, achievement unlocked. It's the, you have got to the end. Yeah.
Well, talking of getting to the end.
Yep, with an epilogue.
Yep. Rachel, do you have a writing challenge or exercise to do with prologues and epilogues?
I have two.
A prologue one and an epilogue one?
Yes.
Ooh.
Coincidentally.
Maybe we should prologue the episode with the prologue one.
Maybe we should do them in reverse. Okay. Prologue and epilogue. Butterfly picture of small child where it's painted on one side and it matches on the other. Do your what if you don't think you want a prologue and epilogue to something, say to yourself, what if I was being paid £1 million for each? What would I do? And one of two things will happen. Either you will learn something useful about your world, or you will have started a new story set in that world.
Yes.
You will have generated material. The second thing I would do, and I hope it's been useful hearing us rephrase questions today, is moving out of a place of fear and into a place of curiosity is not when you stop having shoulds in your head. It's when you spot them and make a different choice. If there is a should in my head, what I say to myself is, what are my options? What do I want versus what the voices around the table of previous teachers, colleagues might be saying loudly?
Might expect of you.
Absolutely. And make a choice that is born of curiosity and not fear.
I think that applies to so much of what we talk about on this show, doesn't it? Well, I don't have a grand epilogue written for this episode.
What?
I know. I'm sorry. So I'm just going to end by saying, Emily Inkpen, Rachel Knightley, thank you so much for being part of this podcast.
Thank you,
Chris Gregory.
Thank you for listening to the Writers' Gym podcast with Rachel Knightley, Emily Inkpen, and me, Chris Gregory. If you'd like to learn more about Rachel and the Writers' Gym, please go to rachelknightley.com. To find out more about Emily, please go to emilyinkpen.com. And for Chris, go to alternativestories.com. We'll print all these links and more in the show notes for this podcast. The Writers' Gym podcast is an Alternative Stories 2024 production for the Writers' Gym. Production, sound design and editing were by me, Chris Gregory.